kind of where all this was going. And I have these slides, which I've presented for years to different levels of depth to different audiences. And normally I pick out a subset of slides to actually show, but I provide all of them, in case people are interested in looking at them. And it's called Overview of the Modeling Process, and really it's designed to situate us with respect to kind of where this might be going, and particularly for these sessions here. Now, we don't have anything for a pointer, do we, here?
I don't think so.
I'm wondering how I can, you think if I, oh, look at that. Okay, that's, oh man, that's pretty good.
Can you have a cursor on this?
Yeah, actually, maybe that's better. Although it just, okay, look at that. Okay, well there we go. Okay, that's a bit better. Sure. One of them was going to get me out of my seat and get me talking. Okay, so this modeling process overview. Broadly speaking, modeling is conducted in a series of stages. However, the whole thing is iterative in the sense that, as I'll be emphasizing, there's a need to kind of constantly go back and refine our understanding of what's in the model, what's left out, what's put into it as we learn. I had argued before, and I didn't think I'd take the time, that modeling is fundamentally a learning, models are learning tools, and modeling is a learning activity. And this is to be contraposed with an easily held misperception, sometimes a cherished belief, that modeling is actually about building crystal balls. And there is a certain quarter of modeling space where people present themselves, often folks who are trying to sell you models they've already built, from the commercial sector, where this is a model that will answer your questions, and you buy it and you will get answers about what to do, going forward. And I think that's a very it's a very dangerous sort of situation, and some of the biggest gains from modeling have to do with going through a modeling process where you're actually using the modeling challenges, thinking through about building up a model. You are actually doing it in a way that gives you insights in the space in which you're working. And models are tools that help us think through the impact of the implications of our assumptions about the world. They allow us to take sort of our best understanding or some understanding about how things might be operating in the world and to understand its logical implications. And they help us compare the implications of those assumptions to the empirical evidence we see from the world. Say, hey, is this, if I assume these things, is it consistent with what we see from the best empirical evidence that we have, and spot inconsistencies, which are inconsistencies that would go unnoticed often if it's just in our head, because we're not very good at thinking things through. And my colleague Jeff McDonald over in Sydney, he talks about models as prostheses. They're learning prostheses. They're things, prostheses like crutches. They help us overcome some limitation. Maybe it's a broken foot like I had 2.5 years ago, what have you, or a year and a half ago, whenever it was. They help us overcome that by providing us other support. And models are like that. The simulation modeling helps us deal with the fact we're not very good as people. As people, we're very good at certain types of things, but not very good at others. And one of the things we're not very good about is putting together a whole bunch of assumptions in our head and understanding their logical implication. We're also not very good if we have a bunch of assumptions about being able to share them with others in an explicit fashion. And much of the use of the benefit of modeling, I think, comes from making it explicit, putting it out there in the open so many people can look at it, critique it, refine it, modify it, but also to be able to run it in a way that's unambiguous and helps us see what its implications are. And those help us spot inconsistencies that we wouldn't have spotted otherwise. And making it explicit often forces us to think through things that are we don't have clarity on, forces us to think hard about the nature of what's going on out there in a way that can often be helpful itself. So modeling is best conducted as a learning exercise in an incremental fashion. We learn things from our models and then we go back to modify them. And here, it goes through a set of stages in each of these iterations where you're conceptualizing what goes into the model here, and there's this ODD protocol, which is Overview, Design, and Details protocol, which helps you sort of think through some of the elements of the model early on, and then as you go forward, it forces you to think in greater and greater detail about the model. So the first stage is what's called problem conceptualization, and then there's a stage of problem mapping. Now, these two stages are largely qualitative in the sense that you are trying to understand what's the boundary of the model, what goes into it, what's left out for those things to go into it, which are the things that it produces, the endogenous things, which are the things that we specify to it, the exogenous things. And we map it out often as a stage to get towards formulating an actual unambiguous simulation model. And this model mapping is something we did quite a bit at my previous visit here in the beautiful confines of the library. We engaged in some closed loop diagramming. Do you remember that? Kara showed me one of the things that came out of that session with Kate and with May, but there were several other models that were built up at a qualitative level. And sometimes these are called models, sometimes they're called model maps, but they consisted of a structured sort of way of thinking about the issues that brought home some features of the situation, like feedback loops, that were potentially important drivers in the ultimate simulation model that might result. And it forced us to think in a sort of systematic way about the issue. Now, following qualitative mapping, this stage, the second stage, often then we go on to a model formulation where we actually take the whole or part of that model map and we formulate a fully runnable simulation model. Okay? And that starts getting into that starts going from building the right model, which is really the first two stages are about, to building the model right. To actually, okay, so you want to build this model, you have a clear idea in mind for what you want to build. Now, how do you actually go about building it? So, how do you add those parameters in? How do you add those state charts in? How do you add those stocks and flows? How do you add those variables? How do you add those events? All those things I've talked with many of you about in past visits. So broadly, I'd say the first two stages are about building the right model, and the later stage is about building the model right here. And here you engage in some model testing and sort of comparison of the model to what is known empirically, testing that the model behaves reasonably with broad ranges of assumptions, doing what's called sensitivity analysis to assess which assumptions what are the assumptions to which it's really sensitive. And then you get in later stages to kind of policy evaluation or knowledge translation of taking that model and bringing it to people so that they can learn from it as well. So the learning goes on outside of the group of immediate stakeholders. Now, for different projects, these look a little bit different. Sometimes the focus of the model is not policy. Sometimes the focus of the model is, for example, to allow us to evaluate biostatistical methods and spot gaps in those methods. Cases where, we have an underlying situation which we know exactly in the model, and we're trying to see to what degree does this biostatistical method or this causal modeling approach or this machine learning approach, to what degree does it reliably tell us about what's going on in the underlying situation? And we can do that with a model because we know the underlying situation precisely. Whereas in the world, it's kind of hard to judge, is this, this biostatistical measure of, this proxy for this other thing, how reliable is it? We can do it in the model with complete clarity, and we can spot characteristic gaps or or shortcomings, or cases where it's strong and cases where it falls short. Another example of a model which wouldn't involve policy evaluation is a model that's geared towards theory building, where the goal of the model is not to sort of compare one result of one policy to another, but the results of the model is to come up with better hypotheses for what might be driving teens to engage in e-cigarette use, together with tobacco products, which is something we see a lot in our data from smartphones and wearable type mechanisms. So models exist for many purposes, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but just bear in mind this diagram is kind of a little bit skewed towards models used for policy. But it brings out a lot of features, and you'll notice I put down here under each of these kind of key things which you're bringing to bear for each of these stages, key considerations, as it were. I'm going to talk in opening minutes here about this area here, because I think it really bears some discussion. Cara will have heard me, for her this will be perhaps tough to stomach, because she's heard me talk about it in Michigan just a few days ago. But hopefully she won't be too violently disturbed by it. Okay, so one thing that I've emphasized to this audience before, I made an utterance, but I just want to emphasize again, is the need for incremental development. And this is going to get into some of my foremost recommendations coming out of these sessions the next few days. What you're going to see me prescribing as the suggested route for every one of these models on here, modeling projects on here, is a model that starts really small. A model that starts really simple. A model that starts in a more stylized fashion, in the sense that it leaves out a lot of features of the world. It's like a very simple map. It captures a few of the essentials, like, there's a big 405 going, through the city or something like that. And then there's, I won't even get into the routes. And there's 105 and 91 and et cetera. Anyway, so it sketches out only a few of the essentials. So why am I going to start that way? Well, one of the foremost reasons is because you're going to get much further in your insights if you start that way and then add things in over time. It's also going to get you so that by October you're going to have something to show. Whereas if you said, okay, we're going to build the biggest, better model, we're going to have a model with all these components in it, that's great, but it's unlikely you will have something to show by October that will be substantive. That's one reason. The second reason is because if you started to conceive right now the bigger, better model in detail, chances are that vision will be extremely naive compared to what you would get by incrementally building it up. Why is that? Because by incrementally building it up, you're learning along the way. You're learning along the way from the model. And that may seem odd because you think the model is something you're directing. So how could you learn from it along the way? Well, you learn, among other things, what it's really sensitive to. You learn by building it to think more clearly through certain issues. You learn, I never realized how big a difference it makes in the model results if we assume this or we assume that. You learn this one parameter it's really, really sensitive to. So it's really, most fundamentally, it's this ability to learn from the model. That's going to take you in a different direction. So a year from now, you're going to have a great, perhaps rich model, but it will be a model that has much more savvy because you've learned what to put in there along the way as you see, the findings from earlier versions of it. So there's a lot of reasons for incremental development, for building this whole, going through this process in a step-by-step incremental way, adding things in. Some of them are listed here, some of the more important ones. You're always going to have some model in hand. That's a really important thing. Always have something to show to someone that it's meaningful. You're going to be able to learn from along the way, but you're also going to be able to find problems sooner. You add one thing in, you see something that's whacked out, you're going to know exactly what you changed, And you're going to be able, if there's a problem in what you changed, you're going to be able to find it sooner because there's only one or two things you change, very small. Whereas if you build the bigger, better model 2 years from now, when you run it, you say, "Wow, that's weird." It's going to take a while to figure out if that's a bug or that's a natural emergent behavior from it. Yes.
Good question. So
Yes.
how difficult is it to document all these little
The steps.
things along the way? Because I remember you had once indicated that there was a study where
Yeah.
at the end it was a bit of a mess because nobody really knew how it was built, if I got that correctly.
Yes, that's right.
Is there a
That's
way
right.
that you can document it?
Yeah, there is, and what it involves is a discipline of saving successive versions of the model away, but having a logbook. It's like a lab notebook,
Lab notebook.
which basically says, between this version and this version, we changed this. Now, we have tools in the computer science area. We have our own ways as well, and these allow us to take two versions of the model and crisply compare them and say, okay, just this changed. It allows us to kind of zero in, okay, what changed between these? Oh, it's just this little thing and this little thing. And those tools are little used outside of software development, but they are extremely useful, and they're actually quite easy to use. And I could show the group here how to compare two versions of a model and say what changed between this version and that version. And actually, anyone could use them. I mean, they're not terribly sophisticated in terms of what they rely on knowledge to use them, but they are very insightful in sort of cluing you in what exactly in the model changed between when what we had yesterday and today, or what we had a week ago. And maybe I'll show you those tools.
Sure, but it seems to me
Yeah.
like a very simple way is just literally to keep
A lab. Well, that's definitely something you
right?
want to do.
'Cause I
Yeah.
mean, I was trained in the lab and
Yeah.
running experiments, you
That's
put
right.
a little bit of this, you put a little bit more
That's
of
right.
that, and after a while you forget what you did. So it's like
Exactly.
having a daily
Exactly.
notebook. And
Yeah.
I think the advantage of that too, and,
Yeah.
and that maybe you can't get from what you were saying,
Yeah.
is that there's a mental thought process of why
Exactly.
we added it.
Exactly.
And sometimes we
intention.
forget that ourselves.
Exactly.
Right?
What was the intention here? We
Yeah.
added this, for this reason, and being able to capture that intention is really important. Now, we also provide, besides using existing tools for this, we actually made, for any logic, an existing tool which we can provide to people. Every time you run the model, it saves away a copy of the results, the assumptions, even what's called the random number seed, which relates to the stochastics and allows it to be totally reproducible. And it saves away a complete copy of the model and a picture of the results and so on automatically. So, and that is also useful for documentation because you can go back and for most models of the sort we'll be talking about, it allows you to make it totally reproducible. So you always have a copy of that. It doesn't supplant the lab notebook because the lab notebook can allow you to record intention, for example, much better. It can allow you to better explicate what's done. But it provides that extra backstop of you can always go back and, that run you did to produce that paper, which you then send out. Once you get those reviewer comments back, you have the exact copy of the model that was used for that with the exact assumptions about the parameter values used for that. And that's really valuable, particularly because they're moving targets often. What you're assuming, what the model, which version of the model you're using, etc. So having that documentation is very, very valuable to have along the way, and the documentation will often be clearer, the intentions will be clearer because you've got fewer moving parts in the model still. Okay. A lot of things here of benefit for incremental development that I don't have time to go into in detail, but learning is perhaps, in my view, the most important one of those. Okay, so this whole framework is done in a very incremental fashion. I'm going to skip forward here. Incidentally, Cara, you heard Ross talk about party, and my version is parties. Not that I'm implying I'm more exciting than Ross, but I break out some additional features that he kind of clumps together in a ways that I think are useful. So I had argued that this articulation of sort of what's the question for the model, what's the problem you're trying to solve is very important. And you have to realize when it comes particularly to participatory modeling, models differ strongly in terms of kind of what they're trying to get. What you're trying to get out of the model differs. It's very easy to fall into the assumption that all models are about comparing different policy regimes, or all models are about projecting forward some future state or what have you. In fact, there's a lot of models, particularly in the participatory area, in the space where Peter operates, or the Albany group with George Richardson and David Anderson operate on the participatory space, where a lot of the goals of the modeling process is to bring together stakeholders who otherwise wouldn't be in the same room, and to really talk about how they relate to each other, how the work of one relates to the work of the other, and to put it into a bigger picture which may help them cooperate better. That's a classic use of a model that's not terribly academically common to see, but it's very practical type of outcome that's being sought from the model. In many cases, however, we are building models to answer research questions, to answer questions, and those questions may be, which of these interventions would be more effective, but it may be questions like, to what degree would this study design be effective in allowing us to measure these certain effects of an intervention, and maybe questions about how should we best marshal our limited data collection effort so that it offers the greatest benefit. Should we put our eggs into getting this data or this data? Should we go do a smaller study to collect this information from a survey instrument, or would we be better collecting this other information? To the degree that the model is a big focus of a lot of the data collection, often you can use the model with sensitivity analysis to try to identify which data might offer the greatest benefits for insight. Other types of questions might relate, for example, to theory building about certain processes. So, identifying a clear model purpose is one of the most critical things. And in fact, when I went through each of these, I went through the agenda, circulated so hopefully by Ling Hui, I went through that and I started to put down, from my best understanding from talking to Tava, talking to Ling Hui and Edmund last year, talking to Kate and to May about the breastfeeding one, I put down what might be some viable research questions that the model was pursuing as I best remembered them through conversation. And from talking to Kara even just last week, we were trying to work at that. But the point is that one of the things I'll be looking to get out, one of the most critical things in the next 2 days is an understanding about, okay, what would the question be that might be suitable for pursuing for a first paper? It's not to say that it's the only question we might ever investigate with the model. Maybe 8 months from now we'll be on to a different sort of question, but at least for this October panel, we want a crystal clear sort of understanding of what we're trying to get out of this model, because that's going to serve as a logical knife to cut away unnecessary complexity. Okay? And this involves, and we're going to go on to think about the model boundaries and so on. Okay, let's talk about some of these questions. I'd mentioned some of them before. The varieties of questions which models could be used. Okay, so this is a question. Identify trade-offs between housing voucher and implication designs in terms of implications for obesity, crime involvement, graduation, and that will end up affecting what causal pathways we end up depicting in our model. If we excluded from this the impact on everything but obesity, there's certain things we might leave out of this model in terms of causal pathways, which the broader question might require us to put in. So the question ends up often, strongly affecting what goes in the model and what goes out of the model. We would end up narrowing down the set of factors depicted in a way that might cut out a lot of details. So we often will use these kind of diagrams, which are semi-quantitative with pluses and minuses, or just sort of linkages depicting hypothesized causal pathways. We'll often be thinking about that in terms of the implications of the research question. What do we need in there? For agent-based and hybrid models, since I spoke on your fair campus last year, we've been doing a lot of work with a modeling language for agent-based and hybrid models. And we first trialed this last year when Taba and Ling Hui, I think, came up to Saskatoon. And we had a boot camp, which, oh my gosh, wow, that's fizzy. That's the first time in about, I don't know, maybe 5 years of drinking a fizzy thing. Okay, that's interesting. I'm a bit out of the game with that. Okay, so qualitative modeling. We created this modeling language for trying to diagram in a way that would move beyond causal loop diagrams for the sort of models that we're talking about building up here. Hybrid models and agent-based models compared to system dynamics models. So last year in the library, we actually did a bunch of causal loop diagrams. Do you remember that? And some of those we're probably going to see the next few days, right? The Tabarian model, the Ling Huian model, and the Rockian model, right? But since that point, we've been working on a language which might allow us to describe those sort of systems in a way that would be easier to capture certain features, things like nested contexts, things like spatial geography and networks, things that like the fact that some processes relate to particular types of agents, whereas others relate to others. Think about a situation where we were interested in understanding how community-based programs for the earliest years end up affecting, outcomes in terms of learning outcomes for children. This is relates to some initial work that I had done with Brenda Poon, who was in Clyde Hertzman's group up in Vancouver. And there we might have multiple types of actors, right? We might have children, but we might have community groups. And the community groups interact with children and indeed with their families. So we might actually have children, their other family members as two distinct types of agents, and then community organizations as three types of agents. And rather than putting it all in one sort of causal loop diagram, we end up using this modeling language, and each type of agent we delineate using a sort of diagrammatic mechanism like this. And we've run now a lot of these in Australia, very successfully using it. And I would say our attempt to do it last summer was pretty successful as well. So we have this modeling language. We also have a tool now for doing this on the computer, which is not yet fully baked. It's still kind of an alpha phase, but it's to allow many people to simultaneously contribute to these diagrams at the same time. So you can log in and add things while I'm adding things and build it up, for brainstorming about these sort of diagrams. And again, this tries to deal with some of the limitations of causal loop diagrams when translated to agent-based modeling. Okay. So we'll have parameters, state, actions, and rules, interventions shown. We'll put contexts of networks here, etc. And that allows us to kind of think in a little bit more of a structured way about agent-based and hybrid models. Now, this key distinction that's going to go in, you're going to hear these terms again and again the next few days. These terms of what's endogenous, what's exogenous, and what's ignored or excluded. Cara heard me talking about this in Michigan, and The idea here is that, ladies and gentlemen, when we're considering a model, as I said, all models are simplifications. They gain much benefit by being simplifications. But in contrast to maps, we're a little bit more subtle in terms of this division of what's in the model, what's out. So in a map, we may leave out of one map sidewalks, where in other ones we have it in the map, right? Here with modeling, we have three fundamental categories that I'd like to describe. One is endogenous quantities. These are things that the model produces for us. So remember, we're running a simulation model, and it's simulating the evolution of the system. Maybe it's people's shopping behavior for food, right? They go and they shop in convenience stores, and they go and shop in markets that have produce, and we actually represent them going to them because we want to understand how distance and transportation limitations might affect their, in the built aspects of the food environment, might affect their consumption behavior. And maybe we represent their actual eating. We represent the fact that when they go to a supermarket, like Whole Foods that I went to last night, courtesy of May and Taba, you may get a bunch of things and then store them. So now I have a larder in my room here in the guest house, right? And I'll eat it over coming days. Whereas if I go to a convenience store and I buy, Screaming Yellow Zonkers or a corn dog or something, maybe it'll just be one thing I'd buy. So here, we're thinking about what's endogenous there. The representation of food seeking is endogenous. The model's actually generating it for us. It's generating how much food is in my larder by virtue of the fact that I went to a supermarket. I have more food in my larder than I went to a convenience store. Whereas there may be other things that I'm specifying to that model in a fixed way. An example would be where the grocery stores are. It's not producing that endogenously, perhaps. It's a given. I tell it what to assume for the grocery store. They're in these locations. Maybe it's based on GIS, right? I tell it, hey, assume grocery stores here and convenience stores here, right? And the model assumes that. So there, endogenous things to be like my food-seeking behavior, the size of my larder, what's in my larder, how many corn dogs are in my fridge compared to...
You keep looking at me when you say corn dogs.
Well, I thought you were someone who could appreciate the cultural iconic status of corn dogs, right?
Yes.
Incidentally, I must confess I'm a little bit behind the scenes about what the convenience stores stock, and so I asked my student, what do they stock? He said corn dogs.
They still have them,
yeah. Corn dogs and Screaming Yellow Zonkers, I don't speak about it from firsthand experience. But those things, we might have a model where those are endogenously, how much is in my larder is endogenously produced, whereas we have the locations of those stores fixed. By contrast, we could have a model where the stores might actually be endogenous. So there, a store might go out of business over time if it didn't get enough people visiting it, right? Maybe there's a supermarket in the core areas of the city. Maybe it's in a food desert or food swamp, a community-based supermarket, and people don't actually visit it enough to keep it alive, and it goes under. There, a model like that might broaden it, and so supermarket locations, availability are actually part of the endogenous components. So when we think about a model, it's not just enough to say, well, there's supermarkets in the model. You got to say, okay, how are they in the model? Are they in the model endogenously, meaning the model is generating them, generating their locations, how many of them there are, where they are, or is it exogenous? We just tell it. And then finally, there's going to be things which are ignored or excluded. For example, for a given model, I might exclude, details of the price of the item. That a corn dog is going to cost me less than really healthy type of food, maybe than a what's that?
An orange.
Than an orange. Okay, good. Yeah, that I can get a corn dog cheap, and an orange is going to burn through my pocket. That might be something I'd leave out, right? Of my model. I just exclude price considerations. I just assume I'm going to go to a supermarket, I'm going to go to a convenience store, and we're going to leave out how much I'm paying for the items. You could imagine a model starting that way and then eventually saying, hey, let's take into account price, because we find that the model results are pretty good at capturing patterns in the empirical data, but they're missing these features, and maybe those are related to the pricing of goods, and maybe we need to consider price in the model in order to capture these set of effects. And then that might go from ignored to exogenous. So in short, there's often a progression over time. As one incrementally develops the model, there's a progression from one category to another. Things that were exogenous become endogenous. Sometimes things that were endogenous become exogenous. We say, we've been representing this, but really it adds a lot of complexity, and I don't see the big gains of it. Let's move it back into the exogenous sphere. Or for this paper, we're going to take it as a given where parks are. Whereas this other model is going to see that sugar-sweetened beverage taxes could allow us to build new parks, and therefore park construction would be, and location will be part of the model dynamics. We might have different models where we have different divisions, and over time a given model's focus might evolve this distinction, the boundary from one to the other. Okay? So one thing you'll hear me asking again and again about these sort of areas of questions is, what's endogenous, what's exogenous, what's ignored with respect to this. And please remember, this is not a value judgment that stands forever. We're not writing these in stone and we're saying forevermore the model will exclude pricing. We're asking for a first paper or two where we need to show results. What is our assumption about what's endogenous, exogenous, that ignored? We may learn after those first two papers, okay, we want to re-examine where the boundary is. But we need a clear understanding for that first paper. And it is very hazardous if you assume that the boundary for the first paper is going to be the ultimate model boundary, because again, then you won't have the opportunity to learn along the way. Okay, and probably the foremost rookie mistake is to try to put too many things in the model. Cara heard, I don't know how many times we mentioned that this past week. It probably came up at least 10 times, from Ross, from myself, from Elizabeth Brook. We've all had the same experience. People put too many things in, and they fear that if I don't put it in now, it'll be forever lost, to lose the opportunity. I'll lose the opportunity. Far from it. You'll be in a much better position to ask, do you want to add it in, after some experimentation with a model with fewer things in it. Okay? Anyway, common division that we're going to come back to. Now, why would we include something in a model? If they're at an endogenous level or exogenous level, as opposed to leave it out? Well, there's a number of reasons, and these reasons run the gamut from stakeholder credibility to areas having to do with representing the interventions. So, if you want to capture the effect of an intervention, say a targeted intervention that is targeted at lower income people, maybe income needs to be represented, associated as an attribute of a person, right? It's hard to imagine investigating a food stamps program for a population where we don't delineate their incomes, because we're not sure who would be eligible for food stamps, who would not be, and we want in our model to represent something about a person's status that would let us represent that intervention. Sometimes we want to know how would something be affected by an intervention. So we're interested in understanding the effects of WIC programs of a certain sort on childhood obesity, in the earliest years, or maybe in understanding the number of people who are in the extremely overweight category, extremely obese category, obesity type 2 or 3 or what have you. If we want to represent that, or if we want to reason about that and ask what the impact is on these things, it's got to be in our model at some point. We want to see output with respect to it, so it's got to be represented in our model, right? Similarly, if we want to know, does this intervention disproportionately benefit higher income individuals versus low income? There's a lot of problems with that with health interventions, right? That sometimes you undertake an intervention, you hope it will raise all boats, but actually it raises the boats of people who least need it, and there's a lot of people left behind, and it heightens the disparities. If you want to capture those transfer effects, you may want to capture some of those gradients in income level or education level or what have you. If you want to develop confidence, the model's behavior is reasonable by comparing some observables, some empirical data against the model, then maybe you want to represent the things corresponding to the empirical data in the model. Sometimes stakeholders also have credibility concerns that they say, look, I don't understand this model, it's just way too abstract for me, and they need a little bit more to grab onto, in which case, representing a feature to speak with them is sometimes a necessity. Okay? And then finally, there's some things that sometimes just to capture certain types of dynamic behavior, it's needed. So so that was the motivation for why represent it at all in a model. Why not just leave it out altogether? Sometimes leaving things out altogether leads to a model which just bakes in certain assumptions and doesn't leave enough insights coming from it. And that particularly relates to endogenous factors. So remember, basically, if I were to put it crudely, if we were to go back here, endogenous, exogenous, ignored. Things that are endogenous, the model tells us. Things that are exogenous, we tell the model what to assume. We can't tell it what to assume for endogenous things because it's producing it. It's simulating how many people over time are obese in our model as we undertake this intervention. It's saying, the rate of obesity is dropping in the youngest years. It's telling us that. We can't tell it what to assume for that, except at the initial state. After that, it's generating it by itself. So endogenous things are things produced by the model. Why would you have certain things produced by this model? Well, sometimes by having it produced by the model, we can actually have extra flexibility and examine the effects of interventions. We could see, okay, how would this intervention yield results from the model? We can sometimes, by having it endogenous, be more robust. So in other words, we're not baking in assumptions that, by age, the initiation rate for smoking is such and such, that, for ages 10 through 14 it's this, for ages 15 through 19 it's that. We could bake that into a model that you have a certain hazard rate of starting to smoke or start to use e-cigarettes during that time, but that kind of will mask for us certain impacts of an intervention focused on tobacco or focused on e-cigarette. It kind of presupposes that these things will be unchanging. Whereas if they're endogenous, if smoking, the choice to smoke, to start smoking is endogenized in a detailed way, it could allow us to understand how do the rates of smoking initiation change with this intervention in effect. And that might be a much more sort of insightful thing. There are times, as we will see in likely one or more of these discussions, where if we don't have some things endogenous, if we don't have enough endogenous, someone could look at this model result and say, well, wait a minute, you've baked into it, with your exogenous assumptions, you've baked into it the findings. Whereas if we allow them to emerge from it, the model is serving an explanatory or generative role. It's generating these things by itself that in a way that would lend some degree of starting confidence or at least face plausibility that it may be helping to explain why we see certain patterns in the population. So we could build in certain patterns to the model, but there we're not getting much explanatory value out of the model. But if the model produces them by itself in a way that's unanticipated, in a way that's emergent, then we can say the model's bringing something to the table. And in fact, Josh Epstein, if any of you are interested in taking this a little bit further, he's at Hopkins, and he used to be at Brookings, used to direct the unit that now Ross Hammond is in charge of, and he has a whole set of essays and chapters on generative modeling. And he argues that you don't really understand a phenomenon until you can generate it without presupposing it. In other words, until you have a model which gives rise to it without baking it into the model, without forcing the model to do that. It gives rise to it from other assumptions that are not directly related to the observations themselves, that are just features of the situation. It gives rise to this pattern we see from the world without trying to hardwire that pattern into it. Until you see that, you don't really understand why that pattern comes about. It's the fact that the model generates it automatically from these other factors that helps us understand why do we see it. And so it is with endogenous factors. Sometimes we seek them because it will help give us explanatory understanding, or it will help it avoids presupposing the very thing we're interested in explaining. Now, the dance here is between having too much endogenous and too little. Ross Hammond talks about, and I think it's one of the more memorable of his phrases, that you have a limited complexity budget to spend on your model. He actually didn't use this, Carol, last week. I was surprised. I think I mentioned to people there that he uses it, which is true. He used it last year to good effect. So the idea is, look, we're building a model. In this case, we're not just building a model. We're building a model to show in October, right? Yeah, we have a bunch of models to talk about. We have only so much we can put into that model. We have a limited, he says, complexity budget, a limited number of moving parts we have time to really investigate, to really put in. We have to figure out how to spend that most judiciously to achieve the goals of creating some compelling insights from the model that are policy relevant or that can help address real research questions, etc. And that could either involve a model that includes a narrower set of factors in more depth, like we really go into quite a bit of detail about the norm creation related to breastfeeding, or it can involve a broader model that's more shallow. It has a lot of factors in it, but each of them is represented at a more sort of basic level. And if we try to do too much, we try to go deep and broad for this model in October, we won't have a model ready. And so this is the challenge. And remember, you're not casting this in stone. This will be a step towards learning, towards richer models, but we got to take our first steps, and we got to take our steps in a solid way. So this endogenous exogenous distinction, and to some degree exogenous ignored, is going to be the key way that we can sort of help ensure feasible delivery of these models in time. It's by being judicious, circumspect about this distinction, and making sure we don't try to put too much in early on. Now, I have lots of other slides about this, and lots of other slides that help think through different examples of this endogenous exogenous distinction, like what do we put in there. But one thing I will say is that another common misperception, well, I said one of the most common rookie mistakes, the most common rookie mistake of beginning dynamic modelers is to put too much in. Incidentally, it's a similar thing with people learning to program. They often will go put lots of things in there because they can. It's flexible. Oh yeah, it's great, but without a lot of understanding of what the gains are. With modelers, one of the fears that they have is that the model won't hold water. It won't be credible with reviewers unless it has lots and lots of stuff in it. And it's particularly if you're coming from an epi background where adding in explanatory variables as covariates is seen as strengthening your hand in terms of review. It's seen as helping to control for various other factors that might otherwise be confounds. It's very easy to assume that, okay, you're going to get a benefit by adding these things into the model, just like you will biostatistically. You're going to add in this variable and that variable and that variable. The problem is that with dynamic modeling, you're often going to obscure understanding by doing that at first. And again, maybe 2 years from now, you'll have that model with lots of things in it, but you'll be much more smart, much more savvy by that time, much more judicious about what goes in there and what doesn't. If you start adding those in, moreover, reviewers will end up coming down hard on you. And they'll come down hard on you because the message of the modeling won't be as clear, the take-home, and also they'll have more points which they can critique. So if you look at what's out there modeling-wise, from myself, from Ross, from Elizabeth, from many other modelers, what you'll actually see are models that are quite simple in many of their features. Now, that's not to say there are no sophisticated models with lots and lots of factors that are in there. There are. But those sort of models are built as the basis of a sustained project over several years, often involving very senior modelers, and it takes many years to get to. And those models don't start that way often. They start in a much simpler way and work towards that. So, in this group, it will be advisable to really err on the side of simpler models. And, you'll find Ross, for example, who I think worldwide is, I could say, is, the premier agent-based modeler in health. You'll find some wonderful models he's contributed that are very simple assumptions. We have agents walking over a landscape filled with chocolate cake and broccoli. And the agents eat chocolate cake and broccoli along their way, and that affects their preferences for chocolate cake and broccoli, which when they then wander into the public health golden land of all broccoli, with all the chocolate cake behind them, they'll still be hankering for that piece of chocolate cake.
I actually don't like chocolate cake and love broccoli, so.
Okay, they'll be hankering for that corn dog. Anyway, Ross, a model like that, which may sound so stylized you find it hard to believe it could get published. Mm-hmm. No, quite the opposite. It becomes highly cited and insightful because it teaches a basic lesson about how people's early life experiences with food might shape their lighter dietary behaviors in a way that is consistent with the literature, can help explain some of the findings of the literature. And even though the model is very circumscribed in what it depicts, it focuses just on these mechanisms, it gets a lot of recognition. So don't be in a situation where you feel, we got to add in more variables to this, the reviewers will never like it. It's a different standard that savvy reviewers will be applying than if you're, trying to look at a nice logistic regression where you're leaving out egregiously certain explanatory variables that would be important to bring to the table. So anyway, I think a lot of the challenges for these models will be in this area. I think really the action the next 3 days, the foremost sort of points of learning, a lot of it will be this area of model boundary. Are those comments helpful at all to people in terms of sort of where we're going? Yes, May.
Questions.
Yes.
So, up to now we've all been very happy with our sample size because we have this huge database.
Yes.
With hundreds of thousands of records. But that's assuming that the child is thinking of analyses.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we're come to a point right now where we're looking at our interventions
Mm.
and realizing that we cannot really get a very good sense of interventions down to the census tract level. Where originally we probably had at least 1,000 census tracts in which our kids live.
Right.
And they do, but we just cannot get it, the intervention, the geographic location of those interventions down to that level.
Yeah.
At best,
Right.
I think right now we're talking about, I almost hate to say, but we probably are talking about 8 regions.
Yeah.
And we might be able to break those down a little bit more, but not
Sure.
much more. Could we do that kind of modeling with, 8 different geographic regions and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, we have
Yes.
rich data on the individuals living there.
Yeah.
But at the intervention level, it's really in these.
Yeah. Yeah, I could imagine approaching that from a couple different angles. And in fact, in the final day, I looked, it was Thursday afternoon for the course Cara was in. I did a little bit of presentation of geographically rooted models with GIS, GIS-informed models, and one of them would involve sort of agents which were different regions, and you might have interaction within a region, dynamics captured, and then some coupling between regions. But yes, I could imagine doing something like that. We'd want to think about how we would characterize the dynamics within the region and what inter-region interactions there would be. But one of the advantages for that could be that, yes, you'd have for each region a defined sort of intervention exposure, as it were. I could imagine doing something for that. Just remember that at an agent-based, okay, so I could imagine a certain clarity about that. At an agent-based level, the deal is if you represented individual agents within that region, they would, of course, be located at different points in that region. Therefore, some of them will be affected by the intervention and others wouldn't. And it would kind of muddy a little bit the picture of, okay, what the dosage is for an intervention. I'd like to think about that. I have some ideas.
Brought it up because I know you've been talking about simplifying models.
Yeah.
It takes
Yeah.
years to build it. But I'm wondering if we can actually develop something relatively simple based on that general idea.
Right.
That maybe we could, and this is maybe not simplifying,
Yeah.
maybe talking. Anyway, if we can build on, say, Cabot's model or Lane Plays, where we add that additional layer of geographic location, is that going to complicate things a lot, or is it just
No. I think something. I guess we'd want to talk about the representation within a given area. It might help if I could address that when talking about each of these models, because I can imagine approaching it in different levels, and if we could clarify certain things about the model, what the model's going to capture, then we could think about, could we capture on a different regional basis, across regional basis. Yeah, so let's see if we could do that. Okay, a couple other things here before we dive into the Tiberian sort of task. Okay, so there's a couple of questions I'm going to bring to virtually all of these models. Okay, so Mike has just returned to the corridors of power. Okay, what is the time frame of the model? So how far out do we have to look? While I'm engaging in dialogue with Taba here, some of you who have other models you bring to bear will want to be thinking about these questions. What is the time frame of the model? What's endogenous, exogenous, or ignored in your model, or as you conceive of? What's the goal of the model? What's the question that you're trying to answer? If you have many alternative questions, can you boil them down into a couple categories? Are there one or two that you feel, given the state of the literature, the state of knowledge, the stakeholders, Tony and others in the Department of Public Health, that they most need, answered or would find the most beneficial? What level of detail do we need to feature? Endogenously, exogenously ignored. Do we need to represent things at the agent level? Do we need to represent within an agent dynamics in detail, or can we just do with a broader characterization of each agent? Okay, now this is a big issue. It's interesting because I use the same term that I think Ross and Elizabeth used. For a paper, for a presentation, what is absolutely important is asking what's the hook for this paper? What's the distinguishing thing? The kind of the main thing that makes this paper stand out in the literature? What's its kind of major distinguishing point, or its most distinctive characteristic? What's it bringing to the table that's unique? What is it that will attract the reader's attention? This is what we might call the hook of the paper. What are people going to remember this paper for? You can use it in these different ways, but to describe what the hook is in different ways. But fundamentally, you're going to want a hook. You may not want to be Captain Hook, but at least you got to be, a researcher, have a hook as a researcher, okay? And particularly for October, we need a clear hook. Like what's the essential thrust going to be? And what is it? So if we think about the model, what is it that we're going to be able to learn from this model? This goes along with the purpose, but we want to be sure when we propose a model structure that will be responsive to that purpose. Could we look at a reviewer and legitimately say we're going to be learning something about X from this model? And this has to do with what's exogenous, endogenous. You may have an idea in mind of the problem you want to solve, but then you're going to be asking, okay, given what I've got, endogenous and exogenous and ignored, am I going to be able to legitimately say we can learn something that will help us address that problem from this model? And if you have too few things endogenous, then could a reviewer say, well, you've baked the answer to the question into the model. You've presupposed the answer to the question by the model you created. Of course you got that result because that's what you told the model to assume. On the other hand, if you have many moving parts to the model, you could be doing lots of extra work, potentially beyond what you need to be convincing that you've actually learned the findings that will be the hook for the paper. So I think that will be part of this whole dialogue on each of these models. Okay. And please remember, on my slides, there's many goals to models. Some models we try to get intervention trade-offs. Some models we try to prioritize a data collection. Some models we use to do theory building, to sort of hypothesize different elements that might be explanatory of the patterns we see empirically. Other models we're seeking to use to bring together stakeholders. Some models we might be using to compare two different theories and test its consistency. Other models we're using to generate data to evaluate the reliability of biostatistical instruments, or in order to tests possible study designs. How big a study do we need to pick up this effect reliably when the power calculation is hard to do at a first cut? We'd be wanting to think, what is it that is the goal of, what is it you're trying to get out of this modeling? What's the modeling for here, okay? Anyway, those are some preliminary comments. It probably went on too long for this, but this applies to all of the 5 or 6 different models we're talking about. So I figure it was worth talking about up front rather than sort of going and, you know, just sort of reiterating it from the start for each model. Okay?
And I think, you know, Taba's going to be a guinea pig. She'll be that sounds very nice experiment model, but she's going to go first. And I think I would encourage everybody to maybe be in the room.
Yes.
So we can kind of see how this process plays out.
And to get your input.
Yeah, get our input, and then these questions I think are really helpful for everyone to think about. But and